Hello everyone! With the arrival of Legion, Blizzard introduced a new system for Mythic dungeons. Now, similar to Diablo, you can push the difficulty of keys. So if you beat a dungeon in time, you will get a random dungeon of a harder difficulty. It actually can also be the same dungeon, but the mobs will just gradually increase in power and life pool. While the system got refined with every patch, the website WoW Progress introduced a scoring system where you can track your own M+ score, or where you can stalk other players and track their M+ score. Currently, Blizzard balances the game around raids. Unfortunately, because while the balance in raid seems to be fine, the balance for M+ keys is currently really out of order. There are classes which perform really poor and classes which feel far superior. I will give my rundown of a tier list on classes for the current patch 7.3. I will back this list up by the current numbers within WoW Progress. So if you go to WoW Progress and look up the numbers of the top 20 performing players of each class, we get a pretty good picture of how well the classes perform. So here is my current DPS tier list, and I will go into detail in the following. So let's start with the trash tier. So Death Knights, at least if we talk about Unholy, can do lots of single target damage. If you have the right legendaries and trinkets, you can even do fairly decent AoE damage. Still, you won't be able to compete with other classes in terms of overall damage like warriors or rogues. In addition, you have like no mobility. Your mobility is even worse than that of a Retribution Paladin. So while being super slow and not having any significant death cooldowns, you're pretty vulnerable. So the only thing which makes the DK kinda special is its combat reds, and we kinda have the rule, the more combat reds the better. And well, another thing which is special about him is of course his grab. It can be fairly helpful if a DK can grab ranged stuff close into a group, for instance the Pelters and Neltarian Slayer, which tend to jump away, or you can even interrupt stuff with the grab, which you can usually not interrupt, like the absolutely deadly AoE spells of the Inquisitors in Archway. But if we just look at the raw numbers, if we look into WoW Progress, we see that the best 20 players of all DPS Death Knights have a score reaching from 2550 to 2350. With that, they are pretty much on the low end in terms of M+ score. DPS Demon Hunters have a similar fate. In terms of damage, they are similar to Death Knights, I would say. Not overwhelming, but kinda okay. Though in overall DPS they have like no chance against the god tier classes. In comparison to the DK, they have a high mobility, giving them at least some value for some boss fights. They can also skill in immunity, also helpful for some stuff, and they have a group stun. So in dungeons like Blackrock Hold with hard trash packs, that might be useful, but on the other hand it might make more sense to just bring a class with really high AoE DPS and just erase the mobs instead of stunning or CCing the mobs. In terms of M+ score, the top players are in a similar range than the DKs, maybe slightly higher. Unfortunately, I cannot talk too much about Windwalkers. If we look into the M+ score, they have pretty low scores as well. Though I believe Windwalkers are not that bad actually, but since the class was so underperforming the last couple of months, people stopped playing the class at all. That's why the overall ratings might be that low. Now let's go to Retribution. I myself play a Retribution Paladin. And I have to say, Retribution got changed in a way that he can put out tons of single target damage now in raids, but in dungeons, pure single target damage is quite useless. At least in the pushing weeks when you play the fortified keys, which are way easier, and not the tyrannical weeks. Now Paladin is a bit tricky. He can be useful in instances with undead and demons, because then his normal rotation stuns the trash for 6 seconds or 30 seconds, but most dungeons don't even have demons. So, as their overall damage is also fairly low, their only real strength is their utility and survivability. So instead of dying, their bubble procs and saves the day. As this skill is up every 5 minutes, this is greatly helpful, especially on very high keys like +21 or +22, where abilities just one shot. Still, compare their survivability to a rogue. Rogue still is kinda more durable and has the damage. Aside from that, the Retribution can give a melee bubble which can be extremely helpful in dungeons like Eye of Ashara, but completely useless in other dungeons as well. Thus he deserves his place in garbage tier, with maybe a few dungeons where he can shine. The best Retribution paladins perform in a similar range as the other low tier melee classes. So they range from about 2600 to about 2400 or even a bit lower. Now we are coming to the worst range class, presenting the Shadow Priest. The problem about Shadow Priests is just nothing makes this class really special. They are not very durable, they have no great CC capability, well, I think they got even a short stun, but really nothing too special. The biggest problem seems to be his ability to put out huge AoE damage. Thus, in overall DPS he just lags behind hugely beyond comparable classes like Warlock or Balanced Druid. Like said, his utility kit is also pretty poor, though he might be useful in multi-target boss fights, like the third boss in Seat of the Triumvirate, which is currently most probably the hardest boss in the game. This means even the Shadow Priest has its little niche. So now take a look at the score and we see the Shadow Priests are also ranging in between 2580 and down to 2300, so they are most probably at the moment the worst class in the game in terms of M+. Now we leave the garbage tier and come to kinda useful classes. Let's talk about tier 3, which in my opinion is only represented by one class, which is the Elemental Shaman. Forget about enhancement, he's trash tier. Elemental seems to be kinda good though. First of all, he has an Ankh. Still compare it to a Retribution bubble and you will realize it is pretty weak. It has like 20 minutes or even 30 minutes cooldown, I don't know exactly, so kinda useless. Though his big strength is high damage. He can do huge amounts of burst AoE damage and even his single target DPS seems to be fine. In addition, he can use Bloodlust, which is only a minor plus since everyone nowadays can buy drums, but he also has a nice 5-second group stun. So in addition to having nice damage and being ranged, which is always helpful, he has also nice utility. So what is he missing? Actually, I'm not quite sure. If we look into the M+ ratings, he's about 50 points higher than the trash tier classes, reaching from 2650 to about 2450. So definitely better, but not top tier. I guess the problem is the low survivability on really high keys. Also, I think Elemental has a high tendency to just ruin keys by pulling with the lightning strikes. I think it is really rare to see a key where an Elemental is not unwillingly pulling stuff with his spells jumping over. Now let's go to the tier 2 classes. In my opinion, these classes are Arms Warrior, Hunter, both MM and BM, as well as Mages. So let's start with Hunters. In my opinion, both Marksman as well as Beastmaster are currently viable. Especially Marksman is dishing out insane amounts of damage. So a Marksman can really easily erase a group very fast. Additionally, Hunters have really nice utility. They have tons of traps, they have their stun arrow, and at least the Marksman has a knockback, which is also super helpful. Beastmasters are, I think, a bit lower in damage, especially in AoE damage, but still appear to be fine. Especially since their pet can also cast a combat rage, which is super important in general. So what is their big weakness? Why aren't they considered god tier? In my opinion, the big weakness is that aside from their immunity, which is the turtle, they basically have no defensive cooldowns. For instance, the second boss in Eye of Ashara or the general in Arquay, if they cast their spells and you don't get an external, the hunters will just get one-shotted. Thus, usually to survive these bosses, hunters have to take stamina pots, use defensive trinkets or whatever, and if they don't have this stuff available, they will just die. Still, if we look into the overall ratings, we can see that hunters are between 2000 and 2700 and 2500 M+ rating, which is more than 100 M+ rating higher than the trash tier classes. Now we go to the mages. If we look into the ratings, they are quite similar to Hunter and about 100 points above above the trash tier classes. Similar to Hunter, the Mage has also two viable specs. At least, in my opinion, I think both specs are kinda viable. Frost is single target focused, while Fire erases the complete trash of the whole instance. Mage brings not a lot of crowd control, like hard CCs, but he is really hard to kill with Ice Block or even double Ice Block, has insanely high mobility, and yeah, once again can cheese a lot of mechanics with immunity, being the Ice Block. Similar to a Retribution Paladin, you can stand for instance in the spear of the first boss of Eye of Ashara and just soak its most lethal mechanic. Still, while mages can cheese some mechanics, aside from their block they are fairly squishy and their overall damage, at least in case of ice, could be higher. I guess if they had a Battle Rats they would be top tier, but in the moment, the way they are, I put them in tier 2. Now we come to warriors, and in my opinion they are super overrated. Everyone, especially after the Mythic Dungeon Invitational, puts them into god tier. But in my opinion, while they are great, they cannot compete with the other top tier classes. And now let's look into the numbers. If we look at that, we see that the best warriors are pretty comparable to the best mages and best hunters. There just seems to be a bit more players within this range as warriors got so popular. So what is so special about warriors? The thing is, warriors can just delete whole groups. Their AoE burst is insane. In the Invitational, people played keys on +17. So if you had two warriors, you could just pull the whole boat, for instance in Maw of Souls, and just erase the whole boat. Now, a thing which disappointed a lot of people, me included, is that the Invitational +17 dungeons were played. +17 is really no challenge at all. I'm currently sitting at close to 2500 M+ rating, and I cannot remember a time when I could not finish a +17 dungeon. So would it help bringing a warrior to a +17 key? Of course. Would it help bringing him into a +21 key? Maybe, maybe not. While still being one of the top classes, he has only few utility, no immunities, and not the greatest defense. So at some bosses there is a high chance he will just die. And it not necessarily have to be the bosses, also the trash can be very harsh, especially on melees. For instance, the trash in Maw of Souls. If you go a key +20 Maw of Souls fortified, it's like the following. The melee goes to the mob randomly hits the melee, and the melee is dead. This is a problem for all melees in general, but at least some classes like rogues or a Retribution Paladin can survive these mechanics. And now we come to tier 1, to the god tier. If you want to beat really high keys, you can play all classes, but if you bring Balance Druids, Warlocks or Rogues, your chances should be much better. So what is so special about these classes? Let's start with Balance Druid. The single target DPS is okay, but certainly not overpowered. But if you run a dungeon with a balance, you most often will see him top the overall DPS, since they can dish out massive AoE damage. So in terms of damage they are a top class. Still, classes like hunters or mages can compete. So what is so special about them? Now the answer is, Balance Druids just have everything. Just in general, they are range, which is already a huge advantage over being melee. And they are extremely tough. Not in a way like Frost Mages, which can ice block and then die. No, they are overall tough badasses. They have a high armor rating and can just always change into a bear form. They are, for instance, one of the few classes which can survive every cast of the second boss in Eye of Ashara. Just switch to bear form, easy. Now, aside from being tough as hell and having nice damage, they have one of the best utility kits. While they do not have a great stun, they have a knockback and sunbeam. If you stun a trash group 3 times, you cannot stun it anymore. No problem for a Balance Druid, they still can knockback and sunbeam. Thus, groups like the Impacts and Code of Stars get super trivial. So you would think this is already a super good kit. Not enough, they have super high mobility with blink and being able to switch to cat form. You can actually skip a lot of trash, you can root stuff, you can go invisible, and of course, most important, you have Battle Rats, which is probably one of the most important tools in every high M+ group. Even the best groups fail, and you should always bring at least 2 Battle Ratses to be safe. If we now look into the M+ rating of Balance Druids, we can see that they are truly a tier above. They are about 100 points higher than the second tier, with ratings ranging from 2800 to about 2600.
If you see that, you realize that the best players of this class have approximately 200 and plus rating more than the trash tier classes. Good game, Blizzard. Not really in point, but if you think about it, beating a plus 22 key with a top class is comparable to probably beating a plus 20 key with a trash tier class. That ain't feeling right, Blizzard. Now let's switch to the next class, being Warlocks. Let's start out with their M+ ratings. They are very similar to balanced druids. In specific, Affliction Warlocks are just sick. They can dish out really insane damage. If you want to see how powerful they are, just watch my plus 21 Eye of Ashara key, where I play Retribution and another guy plays Affliction. It is just saddening how much overall damage they are doing. But aside from doing insane damage, their biggest trait is their survivability. As far as I know, they pretty much do not have best in slot damage legendaries. At least not as extreme as other classes, though they can, for instance, use Priders without losing a lot of damage. Combining this with their own shields and their self-heal, they are by far the toughest dudes in Azeroth, at least in case of range classes. Build a group of 3 Warlocks and you won't have any problems at Xavier's within the Darkheart Thicket. So is that everything? Of course not. While being already borderline overpowered, they have one of the most important tools once again, which is the combat red. Like said before, 2 combat reds are usually a must-have, or in case of a warlock, 1 can even be enough since the warlock himself will never die anyways. So similar to a balanced druid, this class just feels overwhelmingly overpowered. Aside from all this, they offer healthstones, which is nice. Now let's talk about the last god tier class, which are rogues. Actually, I don't know why, but I never seem to be able to find good rogues when I go pushing my own high keys. But I heard they dish out insane AoE DPS. So in that regard they are similar to arms warriors, but as far as I know they also do insane single target DPS. Now if that wouldn't be enough, they are similar to warlocks, nearly unkillable. Before I said warlocks are most likely the toughest dudes in Azeroth, at least in terms of range DPS. But in terms of all DPS, rogues are probably even tougher than warlocks. The thing which they are lacking, which most melee supply, is hard group CC, like a group stun, but you can't have everything. On the flip side, they have the tools to just skip the hardest groups with their shroud and make most dungeons notably easier. For instance, bring a rogue and you can just shroud and skip the double bears in Darkheart Thicket, which are clearly the hardest pack in the dungeon. If we look at the ratings, we see that rogues are similar to warlocks and druids, reaching from 2800 to 2500 in terms of the 20 best players. So here you go, this is my tier list of the current WoW and plus DPS classes. While I think there will always be top classes, Blizzard should really focus more on also balancing M+. I think the single target specs for raiding are fine, but especially the AoE output should be a bit more balanced. Especially classes which lack a bit utility should be able to dish out a bit more AoE damage. Well, that's just my 50 cents towards this topic, and I hope you enjoyed this list and this little summary. And like I said, I will come up with a tier list for tanks and healers in the very near future as well.